Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about discrepancies. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how do you handle discrepancies in coding standards and development practices between offshore developers and your in-house team? That is usually handled by having a CI pipeline. So what I like to say is that the biggest and best investment that you can make for your software quality overall, if you're working with more people than yourself, is to create like well set up a pipeline for whenever you want to make a pull request into the main branch. That's probably one of the most important things that you can do. And in that pipeline, like a really basic one should just include things such as lint the code based on some linting rules that you have all agreed on, like these simple things like double quotes for single quote, line spaces, or like things like that. Those basics are very good. And then of course make sure that it runs the testing, and then that it tries to, if you have a compiled language or something like that, that it's actually trying to run like these compilation steps or build the thing so that you can get an artifact out that is the thing that you're going to deploy and so forth. So it just validates all those basic sorts of things. I even go as far to say that that's probably, to me at the very least, even though it's a very basic setup, as like 50% of the value right there, maybe even more. It's really, to me, a little bit of a shame that most industry professionals don't take the time to really understand how powerful static analysis of software can be. My favorite example of that is linting, where a lot of software developers that I know, they try to follow certain practices and guidelines for certain things, for example, but I always say to them, like, whenever you try get into your head that you're going to make this rule that is supposed to be true for everybody, like we're just going to remember it. A classic one is, let's say that you want to increase the quality of your error messages. So when you throw an exception or something like that in your code, you want to make sure that it follows some type of standard format. Now, most developers that I work with, their idea is that we're going to write a document and we're just going to agree on that it should always include something is going to be, the message is going to be formatted in a certain way, or so forth and so forth. And then they sort of think, okay, let's make a class, or like let's make a subtype of an exception, and let's make that into a standard, right? And then of course people start forgetting to use it, and so it just becomes this thing that like you have a bunch of error messages or standard errors in some file somewhere where you, and then you still find like basic exception throwing all over the place, right? And so that's the situation where I tell people, use a linter for that. I've done this many times and it is my favorite trick. It's the thing that I use for everything. I go as far as to say to my software developers that when they want to make a rule for something, if you cannot express that rule as a linting rule, then don't force me to use it. If your pipeline cannot validate that the rule is being followed in some way, then try to avoid it at all costs. Because reality is that, see, at least me, I forget stuff. Like when I'm doing my coding, I'm not thinking about your rule about how I should name my branch or something like that. That's something that's going to take some practice or stuff like that. But if you have a lint rule for it, that's perfect. It's my absolute favorite trick. So for the linting of the errors, for example, what I do every single time is that I sit down, I write, because I've taken the time to learn how to do static analysis and write my own linters, which means that now I just write a rule saying that, well, it's going to warn you if you use the regular exception without using one of those subtypes that we created, then it's going to lint and say, hey, you should be using, like, it's going to refer you, like put up a warning on error depending on the severity level I put, right? So that it actually moves you to using the correct thing. And so whether or not you have an offshore development team or an in-house development team, it doesn't really matter if you take the time to set up those basic guidelines. Like I try to be a little bit careful though, because some people, and I honestly have gotten to the point now where I will gladly have that debate with you 100 times over, where I have some senior somewhere who's going to tell me that, oh yeah, we follow these practices and we do these things and so forth, and they make up like 100 different rules for how to do everything, and I say I'm not going to do that. because it's just your opinion about how practices should be followed. So unless you have a linter, or like you have like some set of standards that we can all follow and agree on, because if you get too opinionated, people feel like you're choking them. Basically, you're like just forcing them to do things like that you care about a lot. And I always say, try to treat it a little bit like pragmatic. Create rules for the stuff that really matters, and then try to let some of it just sort of be like, if it doesn't really have an impact, my measurement is, does it in any way hinder comprehension in a significant way or produce a risk for a bug or something like that? If that's not happening, then don't create a rule for it, because it doesn't really matter. And so whether or not you have an offshore team or an in-house team, that doesn't really matter, because if you have created a CI pipeline where the testing is being checked and linting is being checked and so forth, then as I said, 80% of the discrepancies shouldn't be happening, because it shouldn't matter for where you are. It's a different matter if, let's say, that you sort of, which classic one is, you're sort of hinting at that one team is better than another, that there are some people who are doing things in the right way, quote unquote, and some people are doing it in the wrong way. And that really comes down to code reviews. How do you handle it? Well, it's very simple. As I said, if you just put those lint rules in place, and like you put in practices such as, we're supposed to write tests, classic one, and one group is having a hard time doing that efficiently and so forth, then you report it to your manager, basically. That's what I do. Like, you try to support people, you try to help them and so forth, but it's at the point now where a lot of the times when I work with software developers who have a hard time following basic practices, and it does actually affect the quality of the software we are producing, then the first thing is, as I said, is to try to provide them with support. But sadly enough, it's not that common that people want to get that help, or they're enabled to, in a very short amount of time, to get their skills up to the level that is required in order to follow certain practices that you might have. And that is, it's sad to say, but I've always found this to be true. If someone has skipped certain parts of their education and we can't train them in a short amount of time, it's better to just find somebody else who can, usually, because it's fundamentally let's just say it, at least what I believe, it's their responsibility to know how to follow practices, if they are within reason, of course. And nobody wants to take accountability for that. I have never to this day met a front-end developer, for example, who will take accountability for the fact that they don't know how to write a unit test, even though it's supposed to be part of what they do. Like, it's a part of their portfolio of knowledge that is necessary in order to ensure that the quality of the software is at a certain level. It's just that nobody takes the time to do it because nobody's forcing them to do it. And I am the last person you want to have that conversation with. I don't care if your job at the previous place forced you to not write unit tests. Like, if they don't care, that's okay, but we do here. And so, just as any person that I hire, either you are able to fulfill like the criteria set upon you at this place of work, or you are close enough that we can train you that little extra bit and you like really commit and you do your thing, or we find somebody else. Because like if you have discrepancies like this, it is because you are allowing that to happen. You are allowing one group to do subpar work because of reasons, and sadly, and sometimes you're going to have to allow that to happen. I've been there a few times where management, like it's sadly the case where you can't just fix the situation, because they won't fire anybody, they won't replace them, and so forth, and then you don't really have any other choice. You can still do the gatekeeping thing in the code reviews and so forth. You can bounce them until they get it right, which means that they're basically going to never, like in practice, not be able to ship something, or until management steps in and somebody's complains about you and says that, yeah, you know, in my case, for example, Frederick, he's really nitty gritty like that, because they will, you know, it doesn't matter what I say, like anybody who doesn't want to take accountability for their role or their responsibilities within their profession is going to do the same thing. They're going to point at the person who's saying that you should have a higher quality and say, you are blocking me, you are putting unreasonable expectations on me, and so forth and so forth. I've been in many conversations where people have said that Frederick is being unreasonable. because I asked them to write a unit test. And what usually happens in that situation, it gets resolved the organic way, which is the manager steps in and does an evaluation and says, okay, why is this person never shipping anything? Well, I'm not shipping anything because Frederick's always blocking me in the code reviews. And I say, well, they're not writing any tests, or like they seem to have a problem following the standards that we have set as the team. And then what happens basically is that the manager will say, okay, either Frederick, you're going to have to let this go, or the person who is like, you're going to have to step it up. These are the two options usually. So what I want you to take away from this is that discrepancies between teams, doesn't matter if it's offshore or in-house, it shouldn't happen, because you should have a basic setup for how to, as I like to say, it's a gateway system where you create a CI pipeline for how to do pull requests that includes linting, error checking, testing, like all these sorts of things. And so just have some basic practices. I try to be very light because I don't really like it when you get too opinionated about how to do every little thing. You will see me like I will throw a fit at you if you start forcing me to have a certain branching name strategy. I cannot imagine something more irrelevant, but there are people who are opinionated about that, and I simply refuse. Like, because I'm so used to having these opinionated people who are basically forcing their will, regardless of if it makes sense or not, onto the product because they read somewhere or like they like a practice and so forth. And I am much more in the realm of, unless it's really important to do this, don't make a rule for it. But if it is important for some reason, like if you have a practice that is really important to follow, try to make a lint rule for it. Try to make it a static analysis thing, or try to make sure that it's happening in the code review, because the code review is usually where most of the quality is going to happen in terms of what people are like, that the discrepancy shouldn't be happening if you're doing code reviews correctly. And then be aware of that some people have different ideas of what level is the right level to put software in. That's the tricky part, right? So if I feel like testing is really important and another person doesn't feel like it's very important, then we negotiate that basically. And if we can't come to an agreement on what practices to follow and how to do it, or if one party can't fulfill the criteria for another party, then the manager has to step in and basically say that either one party learns how to, say in this case, write tests and like do that properly, and so they really have to step it up, or the other party was just going to have to let that go because it's more important to ship on time, for example, than to have quality tests or something like that. That's usually how it goes. But the discrepancy shouldn't be there if you have agreed upon a set of basic standards and you have those checks and balances in place. Have a great day.